The Society presents this oral history by the Honorable Donald R. Ross, who served actively on the United States Court of Appeals until 1987, when he took senior status. I'm Richard Chagru of the Creighton University School of Law. Judge Ross, you're a man who's been able to combine not only government service, but small-town practice, practice in the big city, and of course a very distinguished career on the United States Court of Appeals. But tell us a little bit about your background in small-town America.
Well, I grew up in southwest Nebraska. I was born in Orleans, Nebraska. Started a
Notice they say Orleans and not Orleans,
right.
Or some highfalutin sounding thing.
Right, it's just Orleans. And went to public school first in Stamford, and later my parents moved to Curtis, Nebraska. And I finished my
Now, you weren't the first federal judge who came from that same county, were you?
No, Bob Van Pelt and I both came from Frontier County, and we both had Stockville as our courthouse.
And that's one of the most interesting courthouses in the state of Nebraska, as I understand.
Right, it has not yet burned, but we are hoping that one of these days it will.
So you went to Curtis, Nebraska then, and there you went to school.
Right, I went first to grade school, and then I went to what was then the Nebraska School of Agriculture at Curtis, which was the only high school in Curtis, and which was operated by the University of Nebraska as an agricultural training ground for people from the Sandhills, and also for home economics and teachers who at that time only needed a high school education to teach in the rural schools.
Was your family in agribusiness?
My father and mother were in the grocery and butcher shop business.
So this was something that you did because the Curtis School was there in the town of Curtis?
Right.
It didn't necessarily omen that you were going to go into agriculture?
No, as a matter of fact, it really didn't work too well for me because they had no language courses, they had no business courses, but I did do well in both crops and animal husbandry.
You had influences toward the law as you were a young fellow?
Well, I remember telling my high school principal that someday I wanted to be a lawyer. I don't think I knew at the time why, but Fred Schroeder from Curtis was a good friend of our family, and he was someone I respected and looked up to, and he probably had some influence on me.
And his son and grandsons are now practicing lawyers in the state of Nebraska, aren't they?
And in Curtis.
And in Curtis, Nebraska. Well, did the war intervene before you went off to college, or were you able to start your university training before World War II started?
Well, I finished 2 years at the University of Nebraska, and I finished those 2 years in 1941. And in the fall of 1941, after worrying my parents about whether or not I was really going to take to college, I accepted a job in Guatemala with the United Fruit Company. And I went down there and acted as a timekeeper on a banana plantation from November of 1941 until shortly after Pearl Harbor, when I returned and went into the Air Corps.
Well, that's a fascinating facet of your life that I suppose most Nebraskans don't have any idea about. What were you studying at the university prior to that time?
Well, I was just in Arts and Science College, hoping eventually to go to law school. But I wasn't as motivated during that period as I later became after the service.
So World War II service came along, and you were not only a distinguished young officer, but a highly decorated bombardier as well, as I recall. Tell us a little about your war experiences.
Well, I went overseas after graduating from Bombardier School in October of 1943. And I started flying my missions after some additional training in December of 1943. And I flew 31 missions prior to coming home, which was in July of 1944. But as I was finishing my 29th and 30th mission, the war had just got going good, and Europe, D-Day had taken place, and I was getting, at least in my opinion, better skilled in what I was trained to do, and it just didn't seem fair to me to have all those friends and young men over there in Europe fighting on the ground when I was going home. So I took the option of a 30-day leave home, and then I went right back to England to the same bomb group and started flying missions again.
Well, part of that career in the service was you're being promoted to the rank of major as a very young man. Tell us about that promotion.
Well, when I went back to my old bomb group, I was squadron bombardier, and within a few weeks, the group bombardier, who remains a friend of mine, Walter Coons, decided he wanted to transfer to another base, and I became the group bombardier, which meant that I was in charge of all the bombardier officers on the base as far as their bombing missions were concerned. And I continued to fly combat, and in April of 1945, I was promoted to major. I was then 22 years old.
So when you finally got out of the service and came back to the States, what was your course of action? You were a married man by then, as I recall.
I was married in 1943 before I went overseas the first time to Janice Cook. And
she was a young woman from Dawson County, Nebraska.
She was from Lexington, and from a legal family. Her father and her grandfather and her uncle were all lawyers in Lexington.
And there might have been a hint in their mind that they'd like to have the young son-in-law come back and practice law after a successful completion of law school, I suspect.
That was certainly one of the things that convinced me that this might be a good idea.
Going back to that World War II experience, I know that over the years you have remained very close to the men with whom you served and have been an organizer of a lot of very, very significant reunions with them. Is that a true statement?
Well, that's true. We had the first reunion of my old bomb group, the 306 Bomb Group, in 1983, and we had it here in Omaha with the help of the Strategic Air Command, and we have since held reunions every year at several different cities, the last of which was last month in Washington, D.C., where we had over 700 people registered for the reunion.
My heavens. Well, after the war, you came back to Nebraska. You finished up some undergraduate school, or were you able to go right into law college?
Well, the University of Nebraska had a special deal for vets, and if you were able to pass the aptitude test, which was the legal aptitude test in use at that time, and had at least 2 years of college, you were able to get into law school. And that's the way I got in, although I had, counting the credits I earned in the service, about 2.5 years of credits.
Who was the dean of the law college at the time?
It was Dean Butel.
And he was new on the job and kind of a fiery young leader.
Right. He was a very tough disciplinarian and taught constitutional law and bills and notes.
That's what he taught when I was there as well, and I don't think he got any milder as the years went by. What was your law school experience like?
Well, it was, to start with, kind of a letdown because it was such a calm period in my life after a very exciting period. And I was a lot more determined to do well than I had been the first time at the University of Nebraska. And after the first year, I was elected to the Moot Court Board of Advisors and went on to finish law school in 2 calendar years.
Oh, my heavens.
We had, the first year was from January to August, and that was a full year. The second year was from September to June. I then went to the University of Colorado, where I attended summer school, and then I attended the first semester in 1947 and finished almost in February of 1948. There's a story in connection with that, which if you know Dean Butel, you'll appreciate. When I went to register in the fall of 1947, I went in and told Dean Butel I wanted to take enough courses to graduate in February, because I was planning to take the bar then. And he said no, he couldn't permit that because I wouldn't have enough residents at the University of Nebraska Law School. So I went over to Dean Rosenloff, got a letter from him stating that I would meet the residence requirement, took it back to Butel, and he tore it up and told me that he was running the law school rather than Rosenloff. So he said, I'll tell you what you do. You take my Bills and Notes course, which is a year-long course, and you won't have any trouble with that, and you won't have to attend school the second semester, and you come back and take the final exam, and then you'll graduate in June. So I really took that as an invitation to graduate without a lot of work in Bills and Notes. I took the bar exam then in February of '48 and started practicing law in Lexington in February of 1948. Come June, I came back to the law school, not having studied a whole lot because of the dean's assurance that I wouldn't have any trouble. Went in to see Dean Butel, who told me that he didn't remember saying that, and that the Bills and Notes course had been turned over to Axelrod at the semester. And I went in to see Professor Axelrod, who told me either I pass the test or I don't graduate. So for 2 days and 3 nights, I studied Bills and Notes faithfully, and I passed the exam with the lowest grade I got in law school. And I thought perhaps that they had just given it to me until I found out that one of my colleagues who had attended every class flunked and wasn't graduated. So Dean Butel was helpful, but sometimes he was a little tough on his students.
There's a story that occurred while I was in school about Dean Butel, because the commercial code had just come into vogue, and Dean Butel said to us, "Gentlemen," there weren't any women in the class, "gentlemen, don't worry about this commercial code. It's a passing fancy and will continue to use my books." Little did he know. Who were some of the other professors in the law school who were influential in your life?
Well, David Dow was influential. He was a special friend, and I always enjoyed his classes. Then there was Ed Belsheim, who was very dry in his lectures, but was someone you could follow easily and not have to wonder about the type of exam he was going to give.
Both men who were ultimately become deans of the Nebraska
Yes.
Law College in their own rights.
There was,
You know, Dean Belsheim is still teaching out on the West Coast.
is he?
That's right, 1987 academic year. I'd heard from someone at Puget Sound that he's still out there, still going strong.
Well, he was a fine teacher as far as I was concerned. I enjoyed him more than some of the other teachers who I constantly wondered about. For instance, Julius Cohen was our labor law teacher, and I never was sure what book we were supposed to be following.
You realize, of course, because you have been instrumental in helping a large number of young men and women start their own legal careers as clerks in your chambers, that today, of course, most people do some kind of work while they're in law school. What was the experience with you and your classmates while you were trying to get through law school quickly?
Well, we were all working. I was working in the library at Lincoln, at the law library, and of course at that time we were drawing our Veterans Administration GI Bill of Rights funds, and I had saved about $5,000 while I was in the service, so I was able to supplement.
A veritable fortune in those days, huh?
It seemed like it, but it didn't last too long. Anyhow, by the time I graduated or left the law school in February of 1948, they were completely exhausted.
And the Ross kids, had they started to come along by then?
My first child was born in 1946 in July, and my second child, Sharon, who is now with the State Bar Association.
Director of Public Relations for the
Right.
State Bar, a job that she's held for a number of years
Right.
and very distinguished in her own right.
Sharon was born in Lexington the day after I was admitted to the bar in February of
Is
1948.
that right? Is that right? So you had 4 girls and 1 boy.
Right.
Mhm. And your boy is still in Nebraska?
No, my son graduated from law school 5 years ago, and he is an attorney with the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My other 2 daughters, one of them, Becky, is a lawyer in a law firm in Washington, D.C., and Joan is a school teacher, although right now she is raising 4 little boys.
So
My oldest daughter, Jane, is the public relations director at Wesleyan University.
and her husband is
Her husband is a lobbyist and also a student at
studying
this law school.
Studying law at Creighton University in Omaha at the present time. Well, you indicated with your wife's family and its legal background in Dawson County, Nebraska, that at least there was a desire that you go back there and an opportunity for you to do so. What other kinds of opportunities might you have thought about? Some of your other classmates perhaps were thinking
Well,
about.
jobs were not too easy to come by in those days. Some of my fellow students took jobs with insurance companies.
Mhm.
In fact, Bob Reidman ended up as president of a large insurance company.
Mhm.
Bud Bornhoft went up to Wayne, Nebraska and opened his own office and struggled a few years before he finally made it. Vance Leininger went out and went to work for the Public Power District and opened his own law office, or joined the law office out there.
Mhm.
And Dick Wilson joined the law office in Lincoln, and Bob Barlow joined the law office there. But I really didn't think too much about any other prospect because I wanted to go back at that time to southwest Nebraska, and this was a good opportunity.
It was an
for me to do so.
opportunity to be out there where your wife Janice was from,
Right.
where you were from. It was a lead pipe cinch to get a job, at least as compared with what some of the other people in your class might have been
Right.
facing.
Yeah.
And so you decided to become a country lawyer.
I did.
What kind of practice did you have in that law firm?
Well, I did everything. I went from examining abstracts to collecting bills for our corporate clients, some trial work. I was deputy county attorney on an as-needed basis,
Mhm.
and
That probably did not carry with it a handsome stipend, did it?
well, it was by the day, as I recall, and it was somewhat less than $20 a day.
Mhm.
But it was a good experience, and I seemed to get some appointments from the state trial court there, so
Mhm.
I had a wide variety of experience on relatively unimportant cases.
Was there much circuit riding in southwest Nebraska in those days, moving from county to practice?
There was some, but not in Lexington. Lexington had a judge that came down, Isaac Nisley from North Platte, and sat in Lexington, but and some of the Lexington lawyers did some practice outside the county, and I did some in Frontier County, but other than that, there wasn't a lot of circuit riding.
What was the quality of the judiciary that you faced in those days? Those were the days that the Nebraska judges were still elected officials rather than appointed under a form of merit selection. What did the lawyers think about the people who sat on the bench?
Well, it varied. We had some good judges. We had some judges who had not retired quickly enough. Judge Isaac Nisley had lost most of his hearing and some of his ability to think straight during that period, and he finally quit. And you will recall my classmate Hugh Stewart took his place. Hugh was a good district judge.
You, of course, very early in your career got involved in local politics. You were on the city council in Lexington, and then as a very young man, you were mayor of that community. Tell us about that interest in politics.
Well, the interest in politics started in about 1949, and I was approached by John Van Auken, a banker who also had his roots in Stockville and Curtis area. to become active on behalf of Senator Hugh Butler.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't involve a lot of work, but it involved some.
Mm-hmm.
And I got acquainted with Senator Butler and later Senator Griswold.
Now, Senator Butler, for those who may not know, was one of the great political organizers of all time, a legend in Nebraska history, a man who, as I recall, had become a very successful business leader before he ran for public office and had an organization in virtually every county in the state of Nebraska.
Right. And he was unique in one respect, and that was he recognized that his age was getting on and that the Republican Party in Nebraska needed young leaders in it, and he set in motion a program to recruit young people into responsible positions in the Republican Party. And I was one of those people. Charlie Thone was another, Dean Kratz, Dean Wallace, Jack Jacobson from Lexington, and a lot of different young people from over the state became active first in Young Republicans, and then because both Senator Butler and Senator Griswold believed in this, they became more active in the senior party and held positions of responsibility within it. And one of the natural things would be for you to serve in a local government type office, which you did, of course. I did.
Those were nonpartisan elections, however, I suppose.
They were, although there was some partisan aspect to them. And but I was asked to run by a local construction man who had built a lot of houses and buildings there, and he had some feeling about the council needing younger blood, and so he asked me to run and circulated the petition, and I later found out that he was the only member of the Socialist Party in Dawson County.
Well, you must have been the youngest mayor in the state of Nebraska.
I was. I was 30 when I was elected mayor.
And then it was just a very short while later, President Eisenhower was elected, and you were named United States Attorney for Nebraska.
Right.
What was it like to move from Lexington into the U.S. Attorney's office?
It was frightening. It was really frightening because I was succeeding a legend in the U.S. Attorney's Office, Joseph Vodova, a very fine lawyer and a very fine man. And he had been there a long time and had good assistants. And it was frightening also because I was expected to replace all of the assistants with Republican appointees, as he had filled the vacancies with Democrat appointees. And so I had to recruit some of the younger lawyers in the state, including Charlie Thone and Bill Spire and Dean Wallace, and Guy Birch, 2 or 3 others. But I also recruited Harry Shackelford, who at that time was about 70 years old and had retired. And he was the sort of the balance wheel that we all needed in that office.
What kind of arrangement did you have in terms of Lincoln, Omaha, taking care of greater Nebraska? How did you do that in the office in those days?
Well, in those days we had an office in Lincoln and no place else. And down there we had one assistant U.S. attorney plus the Lands Division attorney, Guy Birch, who handled all the condemnations for the government. And the rest of the lawyers, there were 5 of us here in Omaha. So we, at that time, traveled the circuit because in those days the state of Nebraska was divided into 8 divisions, and venue was established in each of those 8 divisions. There were 8 places of holding court. There were marshals, attorneys, and judges' offices and courtrooms in each of those places. In 1955, Judge Delahunt and I decided that we would attempt to make the District of Nebraska a little more streamlined. And without much encouragement from either Mary Millen, then the clerk, or Judge Donahoe, then the chief judge, we set about to get Congress to pass an amending statute which would create Nebraska as one judicial district with 3 places of holding court and venue established statewide. And we had a very difficult time at first, but we went out, or I went out to the Western Nebraska Bar Association.
You were the point man, so to speak.
I was a point man to sell it to them. And fortunately, I was able to get their endorsement on it, even though they were set to lose all but one of their places of holding court. And in late 1955, the last day of the session, Congress passed the bill changing Nebraska into one judicial district with 3 places of holding court: Omaha, Lincoln, and North Platte. And Judge Delahunt was always very grateful for the role I played in that. He was my friend. He was a great friend.
And he, of course, had been an appointment of a Democratic president.
Right.
So you were able to go across party lines in order to accomplish the streamlining of that whole judicial process within the state. How long did you stay on that job as United States
Until
Attorney?
1956. I resigned in 1956.
What precipitated the resignation? You felt you'd done what needed to be done? And
no, I had a problem at that time, which resulted from a friend of mine from Lexington, a lawyer there, who asked me for advice on approaching the Nebraska senators as a lobbyist. And I saw no harm in introducing him to the 2 senators then, Senator Ruska and Senator Curtis, and he behaved very well as to those 2 senators, but for some reason he extended his visits into South Dakota, and Senator Case was approached, and eventually my friend very stupidly made a campaign contribution to his to Senator Case's campaign, which Senator Case seemed to resent, raised it on the floor, and all hell broke loose. And as a result of that, because I had a part of this transaction just on the very edge of it, the Justice Department people became very leery of anything that might rub off on President Eisenhower. And I resigned as U.S. Attorney. 3 or 4 months later, I was cleared completely by both the Department of Justice, grand jury, and also in writing by the Senate Investigating Committee. But by then I was already practicing with an Omaha law firm, and I didn't make any effort to go back at that time.
As every Nebraskan knows who knows something about the history of those days, it was, you're doing a favor for an old friend with no appearance of impropriety at all, that set in motion something totally beyond your control. And so rather than have an appearance of anything unethical, you stepped aside for another person to come in, and thus avoiding embarrassment for President Eisenhower and for the Department of Justice. You went, however, into a wonderful opportunity to practice law in Omaha, Nebraska, with the Swarmé firm. Tell us what it was like to move, in your career at least, from the smaller and more rural firm into this city operation.
Well, the interesting thing about it was that I was immediately assigned a lot of cases by that law firm, which were important cases.
How many people were in that firm when you started there?
I think there were 7 or 8 of us. There was Bob Anderson, and Mr. Story, Edson Smith, Albert May, Al Royce, David Swore, and myself. And they were very gracious, taking me in as a member of the firm within a few months after I moved over there, and we got along very well together, and our practice flourished. Later, in 1960, we decided to move out of the downtown area, and at the request of Henningsen, Durham, and Richardson, who was my client, and Conagra, who was my client and Bob Anderson's client, we went out to the Kiewit Plaza, where we stayed until 1968, when we designed and built a law office across the street south from the Kiewit Plaza.
3535 Harney.
3535 Harney. And the firm was growing larger. The senior partners had retired, but we had recruited new partners such as Bill Morrow and Sam Jensen and Bob Berkshire, and we had a very good law practice. A lot of it related to ConAgra, and of course later I became Vice President and General Counsel of ConAgra.
You were there in the transition from the old Nebraska Consolidated Mills into the changeover to ConAgra, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yes, it had changed its name about a year before I left the office.
So that must have been an exciting adventure in and of itself.
It was the most exciting law practice that I've ever had, because we were making things happen for Nebraska Consolidated or ConAgra, and I spent a lot of time going all over the country helping them make acquisitions of other companies, and it was a big period of growth. We also had an outlet in Puerto Rico, which was later became the largest flour mill and feed mill in the Caribbean. And we expanded our operations to some extent into some of the other islands. And at one time, I even went to Trinidad, which is just off the South American coast, for ConAgra, attempting to set up a joint venture among ConAgra and a Chinaman down there by the name of Edwin Lee Lum and Texaco. We got it set up, and then the political climate down there sort of disintegrated, and the board of directors exercised its right to go through with the deal. But it was an interesting 6 months of negotiations down there.
I can well imagine. Of course, in the meantime, you'd never lost your interest and that flair for politics. You moved from a county chair of the Republican Party into a significant national officer within the party, and a person who was looked at from really all over the country for leadership within the GOP.
Well, I went on the National Committee in January of 1958, and I had been county chairman, as you indicated, and also general counsel of the Nebraska Republican Party. And I then became a good friend of the Ohio National Committeeman, Ray Bliss. Had a great deal of confidence in his ability to organize. And we did a lot of things together. Also on the National Committee at that time was my friend Richard Kleindienst, who later became Attorney General. So in 1964, I supported Goldwater for president, of course, but during the last month or two of the campaign, I recognized that Senator Goldwater had succeeded primarily in dividing the Republican Party and was going to suffer a very bad defeat. So prior to that time, with the help of Senator Ruska, I started organizing a group of National Committee people who would try to convince Senator Goldwater after the election that we had to have a neutral national chairman. We had at that time his hand-picked candidate for national chairman, Dean Birch, and he was not well accepted among the more liberal elements of the party. And after the election, a lot of the governors were calling for his resignation, and Senator Goldwater was being very difficult about it because he didn't want to have the appearance of him being forced out. So I organized a group of Midwest Republican National Committee people to try to convince Senator Goldwater that we were his friends, first of all, and had worked for him, and that we did not want there to be a harsh National Committee meeting at which we threw Dean Birch out, although we felt we had the votes to do it. And try to talk him into making the change as part of his idea rather than ours or anybody else's. And we did succeed in convincing Barry Goldwater of that, and to the amazement of all my friends on the National Committee, Dean Birch resigned and Ray Bliss was elected national chairman, and at that point I became vice chairman.
And the interesting thing is, from political observers' point of view, from the defeat of 1964 came the reemergence of a totally revitalized party, which was able to capture the presidency not just once but in a succession of victories, with only one exception since that time.
Well, at that time, in late 1964 and early 1965, you'll remember that people were talking about the death of the Republican Party.
Exactly.
And we knew that if we didn't get everybody back in the same corral, that we were going to have a lot of trouble from then on. So we asked for the assistance, but also the forbearance of the Rockefeller people and the Romney people, and asked them to let this be a Midwest project, and with a Midwest chairman, Ray Bliss, who was ideologically neutral in every sense of the word. He was a man who concentrated on organization, and they finally stepped back and let us do it, so that once it was done, the Romney people, the Rockefeller people, the Goldwater people, the Nixon people, all of them were cooperating with us in forming a better Republican Party. And one of the vehicles that was used was originated by Ray Bliss as national chairman, which was called the National Coordinating Committee, which was created in 1965. And on it were all of the living candidates for president in the Republican Party, and Eisenhower, Nixon, even Alf Landon and Dewey, and we then also were included the leadership of the Senate, the leadership of the House, and the leadership of the Governor's Conference, together with the principal officers of the Republican National Committee. And I was a member by virtue of being the vice chairman of the National Committee. And for 3 years we met quarterly, hearing task force reports and laying the groundwork for the platform at the 1968 convention. When we got to the convention, everybody was working together as far as the platform was concerned, and it sailed through without being extremely liberal or extremely conservative, but on a very practical note. And we left that convention in 1968 completely united behind Richard Nixon. And that was one of the great accomplishments of Ray Bliss's administration as national chairman.
Whereas, of course, in the Democratic Party, you're hopelessly divided as among the followers of Gene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, and the loss was in the air.
Right.
Your political connections have served you in a positive and certainly professionally sound way. And there's a marvelous story that's told about you with respect to what occurred when Judge Blackmun of the 8th Circuit was appointed by President Nixon to the Supreme Court of the United States, and you were visiting just coincidentally with Senator Ruska. Share that story with us.
Well, I was in Washington with the Omaha Chamber of Commerce, and I forget what project we were promoting, but we were promoting some Omaha project. I was not there as a politician or as a lawyer, but just as a member of the Chamber of Commerce. And I went into Senator Ruska's office right after lunch that day, and Dean Polenz, who was Senator Ruska's administrative assistant, told me that he had just had a call from the Lincoln Journal, and they wanted to know.
A newspaper that he had used to work for when it was a Pulitzer Prize winner back in the 1940s.
Right. And whoever called, I think I know the name, but I'm not sure, so I won't repeat it, wanted to know if I was back there attempting to convince Ruska to support me for Harry Blackmun's position on the 8th Circuit Court. And the truth of the matter is that neither Senator Ruska nor Dean Polenz nor I had ever thought about that, because we just assumed that that was a Minnesota vacancy and that it would go to Minnesota.
Not to mention that we already had a circuit court judge
Right.
residing in the state of Nebraska.
Actually, we had two. We had senior Judge Harvey Johnson residing in Nebraska. So, but we got to talking about it, and Dean Polenz said, well, they've got two judges in Minnesota, Harry Blackman and Judge Haney, and I acknowledged that, and he said, and not only that, but they haven't got a single Republican senator there. And he said, why shouldn't Nebraska have two active circuit judges rather than Minnesota? Well, that started me thinking, and I called home, talked to my wife, talked to my law partner, Bob Anderson, and then talked to my boss, Alan McTeer. By that time, I was spending most of my time working as Vice President and General Counsel of Conagra. And I then went over and talked to Senator Ruska in his Capitol office, and we visited for a while. By about 3:30, we had decided that maybe it was worth a shot. And Senator Ruska called Senator Curtis and asked him if he would join with Senator Ruska in submitting my name, and Senator Curtis agreed immediately. The letter was then composed and typed, and it was on the desk of Attorney General Mitchell by 5 o'clock that afternoon. And I assure you, I had no idea or intention of making application for that office. And I'm sure the Lincoln Journal, which had not been especially friendly to Senator Ruska and his friends, would have been very unhappy if they knew at the time, as they do now, that their suggestion was going to result in an appointment that they weren't particularly friendly to.
You sailed through the confirmation process, as I recall.
Right. Well, there was one hitch, and that was a former governor of Nebraska, who shall remain nameless, went back to Washington with all the clippings from the resignation as U.S. Attorney, except the ones where I was cleared. And he gave them all to Senator Birch Bayh, who started making noises. And
He was an Indiana Democrat who served on the Judiciary Committee.
And he talked to Senator Gale McGee, a Democrat senator from Wyoming, who, as it turned out, was one of my friends. His brother was my close friend in Lexington, my doctor and my client, and Senator McGee was not especially friendly to the former governor that was back there. And so he called me and said, why don't you come on in here, and bring the rest of those clippings. He brought the rest of the clippings back. I brought the rest of the clippings back and gave them to Senator McGee, who took them promptly over to the office of Senator Bayh. And the next day, Senator Bayh called Senator Ruska and said that he had been terribly misled, that he apologized, and that there would be no fight on my nomination whatsoever. I was confirmed unanimously by both the Judiciary Committee and the entire Senate.
No one's ever suggested that in your tenure as a judge that there wasn't a lot of work to do. As a matter of fact, you've got a remarkable record in cranking out 1,000-some opinions over the 17 or so years that you had been in active status. But the fact of the matter is that for a person who had been so deeply involved in the adventure of business and the practice of law and politics, wasn't this a remarkable change for you to move into the rather sedentary occupation of federal judge?
It was a real difficult change for me, because all of a sudden I seemed to be cut off from the rest of the legal world, except the lawyers who happened to come to St. Louis to argue their cases. And also I immediately had a good friendship with the other judges, but there were only 8 of us at the time. And they lived in different cities. And I was here in Omaha a lot of my lawyer friends felt it was improper to continue to socialize after I became an Eighth Circuit judge. And I was pretty lonely. I finally got fairly well used to it. I was able to keep my political friends with whom I would sometimes discuss politics, but I had to remain completely aloof from it in every public way. And
there is a remarkable warmth felt toward you by every woman and man who has served as a clerk in your chambers. And I know you're too modest to tell us what the secret of that warmth is, but describe for us how you've gone about selecting the men and women who will have that special honor.
Well, I solicit applications primarily from Creighton University and from the University of Nebraska. I've had one or two other law clerks, but I've always tried to hire from those two schools because the judges back east will not hire from the Midwest, and I think it's terribly unfair, so I try to do my share to make sure that the top students in those two law schools at least have an opportunity to have a judicial clerkship. Sometimes I get the applications without asking. Sometimes when I feel that I have not received sufficient applications, I will call one of the law schools and ask them for the names of their top 5 or 6 students, and then I'll go out and recruit. I have recruited here. For instance, you remember my friend Fred Bates.
Of course.
I recruited him after his freshman year, after I learned what his grades were, and he then, after he graduated, came to work for me for 2 years. But basically, I look for people who like to write and who have had experience in writing for the Law Review or elsewhere. I like those who have a practical mind, and I can usually tell that after a half hour or so of interviews, and who may have completely different philosophical views than I do. And most of the clerks I've hired have been Democrats, because I suppose the top students at the University of Nebraska and Creighton are about 90% Democrats until they get out and start paying taxes. And then a lot of them have converted. Anyhow, it's been a really rewarding experience. One of my finest law clerks is your assistant dean, Barbara Gaskins, who worked first for Judge Lay and then for me, and was just an excellent law clerk, and who was the person who I trusted a great deal in her preparation of memos and in her preparation of proposed opinions.
Every judge obviously operates chambers a little bit differently, and I suspect even within a judge's career, he or she may change their mind as to how they use it. You suggest that the clerk would write a memorandum and sometime a draft of an opinion. How do you make the decision how to handle that?
Well, it's a matter of practicality mostly. We have so many cases. The caseload in our circuit is now 5 times as much as it was when I went on the court. And you have to handle cases on a volume basis. And it's very essential that before you go to court, the judge reads all the briefs, but he doesn't have time to do the preliminary research that is necessary. And the law clerks, all of them, have written memorandums prior to oral argument, and I have those in front of me during oral argument. Then after the conference is completed, we go back to Omaha and write the opinions. And the clerks by then know what the result of the conference has been, the reasons for it, and have received instructions on how to write a proposed opinion reflecting the views of his or her judge. And that has worked very well for me. There have been some opinions which I have written myself, but by and large, we work with the proposed opinion by the law clerks, which is then changed to the extent the judge feels necessary.
In that respect, you operate your chambers Well, like one might in a law firm with a senior partner and a younger
Right.
associate. You have to have the trust and the confidence in that younger person
Right.
to do that job. And this, of course, was evidenced for those who are viewing this oral history at a later time, at the time of your stepping down from active status and the ceremonies in Omaha with a large number of those men and women who had come back from all over the country to do honor to their old boss. I think that was a great tribute to you, Judge.
Well,
You're a young man, however, yet, and you're taking senior status. You're only 65 years of age, and what are you going to do with all your time? You got plenty of work to do if you want it.
I'm going to work as much as I feel my happiness depends or needs to have the work. And it may be half-time, it may be a lot more than that. But I'm going to play some golf, spend part of the winter in Phoenix. And
There's some liars around who say you play a decent game of golf. I suppose we could forgive them for an exaggeration from time to
most
time.
of them are lawyers who are trying to impress me.
And an opportunity to get up to the North Country as well.
Right.
The
In
weather
the
gets
summer,
hot.
I have a home up in Alexandria, Minnesota, and a great golf course up there and some fishing.
And you and Mrs. Ross will have an opportunity to spend some more time with those grandkids as well.
Right. Right.
We've been visiting with the Honorable Donald Ross, Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit, who in 1987 took senior status. This is one in a series of oral histories of the United States courts for the Eighth Circuit. I'm Richard Chagru of the Creighton University School of Law.